As you know, we live now in a post-truth world. We live in a world of fake news. We live in a world where anybody, literally anybody, can be a publisher in any medium. So what's that doing to media ethics and media freedom? Are we freer? Are we more ethical or less ethical? And does anyone care?
We spent a lot of the time today talking about the new and how we adjust to the new. I want to talk a little bit about, if you're going to talk about ethics, we have to understand what we mean by ethics and what do we mean by journalism, about revisiting some of the back to basics which are necessary. So if we're going to talk about journalism ethics, we should sort of talk about what we mean about journalism. And the first thing I want to say is that it's really important to understand that journalism of itself is not free expression. It's not unrestrained free speech, and in fact it's what I would call other regarding expression, because it has public purpose and it works in a framework of values, and it is other regarding. Now that makes it completely distinctive from free expression, which, as we know, gives voice to any opinion. It can be biased, it can be offensive, it can be insulting, it can be different. That's actually the glory of free expression, and it is crucially self-regarding. Now, this, it seems to me, is absolutely important. It's the standpoint which actually distinguishes journalism from other forms of expression. And so, therefore, when we talk about fake news, it's very important to understand that this poses the big challenge we've talked about. Fake news is not just journalists who get it wrong, which is how Donald Trump defines fake news. Fake news, and we've developed, I think, an important way of trying to define it, the deliberate fabrication of information with the intention to deceive and to call into question known facts. And it's very important to see this as that what we're talking about. Journalism makes mistakes, of course it is, but because a journalist makes a mistake, that doesn't mean that that media is engaging in fake news. It's really important to understand where this comes from. We have around 420, 430 codes of conduct of journalism around the world. They come from all sorts of different sectors. When you boil them down, they come down to these 5 basic principles. First, accuracy and fact-based communications. Second, independence. Journalists aren't propagandists. Thirdly, impartiality. Journalists recognize there's more than one side to a story. Often there's more than 2 or 3. Fourthly, and perhaps the most important, humanity. Journalists do no harm. Journalists seek to make sure that what they print, what they show, it does not do damage. And fifthly, journalists are accountable and they're transparent. Now, it's these principles, accuracy, independence, impartiality, humanity, and transparency, which make journalism different. The problem about it, and we've heard a lot about it today, is the open information crisis, which is encroaching upon the media's capacity to promote and provide ethical journalism. And we see that from the state, and we see it from corporate power, and we see it through what I call here citizens' voice, which is in fact what we would call the social networks. It's the power outside the newsroom, which is now working inside the newsroom. And the digital challenge that we have to work on is that the business model of the major social networks ignores publisher responsibilities. And what do I mean by that? I mean publishers, whatever they publish on, whatever platform they publish on, have a public interest responsibility, and it's basically to defend the values which I talked about earlier. Google and Facebook and so on may be the world's largest publishers. They certainly make more money out of journalism than any other institutions around the world, but they do not accept that they are publishers. They do not accept publisher responsibilities. They say we are tech companies and tech companies alone. And that is a really important challenge to ethics. Then we have the problem of the echo chambers and filter bubbles that exist with the audience. We have online bias and targeted political propaganda, which is beyond existing regulation. And we have a threat to democracy from a decline in public access to pluralism of information. We have this sort of thing that in the traditional press, where you see journalism, which should be serious journalism about political issues, basically reduced to a cartoon caricature, in which media do not show a proper responsibility or respect for the issues, and so on. So the question of what ethics, what do we mean by ethics? The ethics are who decides whether or not this is a decent picture or whether it's an obscenity. That's an ethical question. Who decides whether or not to use this picture of a dead child as and with all of the questions related to privacy that are involved in that, or this picture? same child but actually telling a different story by the way that the picture is used? Who decides that question and on what basis? Who decides whether or not this is one of the most violent pictures that we've seen in the last 50 years about warfare and so on? Who decides whether or not that picture should be used in the public interest? Who decides whether or not this picture should be used in the public interest? Is this hate speech or is it not? These are deeply important ethical questions which get to the heart of the question of decency, honesty, and truthfulness in society. And the question is, how do we deal with it? And I think we need to strengthen ethical journalism. Somebody talked earlier about training and training in the basics of journalism. I couldn't agree more. I think we need to really use ethical journalism as an inspiration for civil public communications. We need to defend and extend information pluralism. We talked about media literacy earlier on. I think that's absolutely critical. We need to not follow the road of some countries, including countries like Germany, which are seeking to impose legal restrictions on free expression. We need to sort of support voluntary principles. We need to promote ethical journalism as a trusted source for both online and offline. And finally, I think we need to encourage better journalism. I represent journalists, I represent ethics and journalists, but I don't fool myself into believing that journalism is actually 100% good. I know there's a good, bad, and ugly in journalism, and we have to make it more ethical, but I think we need to make journalism more positive, more constructive, but all of it, as always, should be ethical.
We have opened up the avenues for greater participation. There are many more people, citizens, who express themselves, who participate in the political and social process. But at the same time, one wonders whether we have all become more ethical. I'm not so sure. I'm not sure whether we have become more responsible. I'm not sure whether we have become more conscious of our obligation to our fellow human beings, to the environment. These are major ethical challenges that confront all of us. And I'm not talking just about fake news and about what has been happening in the last few years as a result of the expansion of new modes of communication, the new technologies. Yes, it's true that we are confronted by this phenomenon of fake news, but the challenge that confronts us is much deeper than that. It has got a longer history behind it. Fabricating news, fabricating analysis, lying, distorting, creating situations which are artificial in order to pursue a certain agenda. This has been going on for a very long while, before the new technologies, and we have to recognize that. How would you describe what happened in 2003? The whole question of weapons of mass destruction. What was that? It was fabrication. And people knew it was fabrication, but it was peddled nonetheless as something that was important in terms of international politics. It became the basis for a war. The most unjust and immoral war in history, as someone described it. And more than 1 million people died as a result of that war. And that's not the only instance. We have had other instances, including the case of the babies who were pulled out of the incubators in Kuwait, which is again fake news in a sense, invented, fabricated, and used as a basis to justify a war of a different sort. And it's not just the United States of America or its allies who've been involved in this. Let's not forget that if you look at the old Soviet Union, what it did in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, and if you look at the way in which the media related to the Soviet Union, the way in which they peddled these news items, that was also fabrication, distortion. Or in the case of China, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. It's only decades later that we have come to know what really happened, the truth. So this, to my mind, is what should really concern all of us. That the truth can be hidden for so long, the truth can be camouflaged and concealed, and thousands, millions of human beings become victims of this hideous, ugly process, which has happened all over the world. Big powers, small nations, this happened all the while. And this, in fact, raises a fundamental moral issue for all of us, not just journalists or citizens who are trying to express themselves. For society as a whole, this is the most fundamental question. Can we allow this to continue? Should not we speak the truth at the right moment? The truth emerges decades later, but that's not enough. At that right moment, should not we have the freedom, the scope to speak the truth? And this is what doesn't happen very often. You look at something else that all of us understand very well today, the environmental crisis. When people first started talking about the environmental crisis, in the United States of America, for instance, someone like Rachel Carson wrote about the environmental crisis in a sense. She was dismissed as a crank. And there are many others of that sort. This is the point that one wants to emphasize. There are voices on the margins of society. Today, there are voices on the margins of society talking about terrorism, telling us things about terrorism which the mainstream media, and I'm talking of respectable media outlets, they don't talk about this. Who is behind terrorism? Who finances? Who supports terrorism? What sort of ideological purpose does it serve? Whose agenda does it fulfill? Or about hegemony, or about authoritarianism in various countries. We don't talk about these things, or we conceal them, we camouflage them. This, I think, is the real problem, that we are not listening to the marginalized voices. We are not listening to the truth that is there on the margins of society. This is, to my mind, our responsibility, the real responsibility of all of us as human beings, because over and above everything else, we are human beings first and last, and we owe this to our humanity, we owe this to our fellow brothers and sisters.
Is there a way in which the internet actually is giving a voice to the marginalized, is providing an opportunity for people to set the record straight? And we shouldn't just think that the only reliable news comes from journalists, that some of the reliable news is actually coming from ordinary people who are speaking up in places where the journalists aren't telling the true story or the full story.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Graham, that this is actually the real issue before us, because there are, I think, people who believe these alternative channels of communication because the mainstream is not telling the truth. So they are fulfilling more than a social responsibility. They are upholding what we would regard as the most important principle in journalism, the principle of telling the truth.
The problem, of course, is trying to figure out which position to adopt on an issue, particularly when there's so many different points of view, there's so many opinions on the issue which proliferate throughout what we understand today as the new media. And of course, this is made more difficult when there is a sense of distrust about traditional forms of journalism, which is seen to represent an older generation that has become somewhat disconnected from the contemporary. Now, when I hear this, I am a little bit disturbed, because sometimes I wish my students would be slightly more analytical in trying to figure out what they mean by what they say, because what they're concerned about is not so much about a generation gap, but really about why is it today that we are unable to assess a piece of information properly. I mean, what makes it so difficult? Why is there a growing sense of distrust within the public sphere? And fundamentally, I think this is about each other, not just talking about institutions, organizations from the past. And I worry about this. And I worry about this because when I look at my students, for example, to touch upon a point which Aidan raised, which is talking about, in a sense, restraint in dealing with some of these issues. Restraint is an ideal, and I think I'd like to imagine that a lot of me and my colleagues, we practice some of this restraint when we forward an opinion. However, I find that the kind of political correctness which is pervasive in our public institutions today is equally damaging to discussions over the truth, because it's easy to hide when you claim either victimhood or you claim you're being oppressed by a larger group, social group, and this can be a problem. And I think if you talk about restraint, if you talk about the desire not to offend, where do we draw the line? And who decides? Do we decide collectively? Or the victims, the perpetrated victims decide? Who? Who decides? And this is the greatest danger about the kind of public culture that we have today. But there is also the other side of the coin, which is censorship. When we talk about self-censorship, what does that mean? I mean, how can we have a proper discussion? For example, recently we spoke about bullying in Malaysia, and bullying with a taint, of course, of race involved. And yet, the whole idea of dealing with the problem of bullying, so to speak, within its proper social and historical context, were completely sidelined. What you wanted to talk about was essentially trying to appease the kind of sentiments that was going viral throughout social media regarding what people may or may not find offensive about bullying, inverted commas. I'm not saying that any of these things are good things, but what I'm saying, and I'm pleading for a lot of people, is that, especially for journalists, is that for me as a consumer and for my students, is that we need more serious, informed, and perhaps to some degree, some might interpret as aggressive discussions taking place in the public sphere. This kind of self-censorship, this kind of political correctness is extremely damaging. And I think, to my mind, I look at political correctness and I look at self-censorship more often than not as being something extremely unethical, because you're trying to avoid the truth sometimes, because there's a very thin line between wanting not to offend and avoiding the truth.
So some questions from the audience now, please.
Media freedom is not absolute. There has to be a certain degree of responsibility as well. Because we all live in different societies, in different environments. And what may be a good discussion in one environment may not be safe and conducive for another country, another situation. So in terms of media responsibility, I mean, how important is that in this fast-changing world, especially in regards to social media, where there's seriously no responsibility?
The fact that Seymour Hersh, one of the best investigative journalists, who was responsible for My Lai and Vietnam, he exposed what had really happened, and he said, look, you know, this is not true. There's no basis for the allegation made by the mainstream media, and yet there was hardly any coverage. If the mainstream media plays that sort of role because of its relationship to the powers that be, you should not be surprised that people turn to other channels to learn the truth. And they say, look, the truth is coming from the alternative media, from other channels.
To a large degree, all these organizations are dependent on the fact that at the end of the day, it's a job, it's a corporation, there's money involved, and people need to live.
Who pays for journalism? Is it corporate? Is it governmental? Who pays in the end has an absolutely clear influence on the nature of the journalistic product and so on. And it seems to me that one of the things we do need to do, if we're going to have genuinely pluralist journalistic coverage and so on, we need to look for new mechanisms for creating a cordon sanitaire, of a ring fencing of journalism to allow journalists the freedom to be able to report on some of the things that actually very often people who own media would prefer not to be discussed, and people who want to use and manipulate media for their own political interests would prefer not to have discussed. So there's a question for the future. If journalism can't make money on its own through the traditional market processes, which is increasingly the case, and most of you here are working for public service media that are funded in one way or another by taxpayers and so on, and not by the open market. The question is, how do we ensure a stream of funding that will guarantee good quality journalism so that citizens are properly informed, but how do we ensure editorial independence at the same time?
I'd like to imagine where people become slightly more responsible for their actions and that their moral conscience guides them in their day-to-day working as a journalist. And if they do, I think that's the best that I hope for, because you can only follow what you think is honest and sincere and true, though you might be wrong, and see it to its end.